Everybody, can you hear me? Is there an echo? Because I have two different mics. I can switch it if there's an echo and it's annoying. So, echo? Yes? No? You guys can hear me okay? All right, awesome. So then I could take this thing off, which is awesome. So welcome. What a beautiful room and what a wonderful place to be. I welcome all of you. It wasn't so long ago that I actually sat in your seats, believe it or not. So I love the fact that there's so many bright faces here that are looking to get better educated in the disease state of obesity. It is a wonderful field of medicine, and I know that all of you are going to hear wonderful lectures today and get great information. So without further ado, these are my disclosures. And so every talk today you are going to hear or see this, and this is basically saying, recognize that we do not know the questions on the exam. Our goal here is to give you as much information as possible to help you in your preparation and to focus your studies, but we really do not get the questions. We do not know what's on the examinations. Okay, so our objectives for today are to define obesity. This talk is epidemiology and prevalence, as well as discussion of obesity-related comorbid conditions or disorders. So we're going to define obesity. We're going to talk about the incidence and prevalence of obesity in the United States. We do recognize this as a global epidemic, but we're going to focus on the statistics in the United States because that's what's going to be important for you for your examination preparation. We're going to talk about the different cultural, genetic, environmental contributors to the obesity epidemic. We're also going to review the financial implications of obesity on our world today. In addition, talk about the pathophysiology of some obesity-related disorders as well as psychosocial impact of the disease state of obesity. So here's our definition, okay? Obesity is defined as the abnormal or excess fat accumulation or adiposity in the body that may or may not impair health. And BMI, which is body mass index, which is simply a calculation of weight in kilograms to height in meters squared, has been used as a standard screening tool. And it essentially is used to measure or indicate a measure of obesity and overweight. And we're going to review how it's used to classify weight, but also review what the limitations can be in terms of utilizing just BMI alone, which most of you may be familiar with. So what does BMI do? It helps us screen individuals who may be at risk for other diseases. And the classifications of different BMIs, of underweight, normal weight, overweight, and the different subsets of obesity of 1, 2, and 3 class, I would know. And you want to know those numbers in terms of, for instance, overweight of 25 to 29.9. So those distinctions are important. However, what are the limitations of BMI? This may be something that you are already familiar with. And it doesn't give us information about lean mass versus adiposity. We're familiar with people who may have higher BMIs but have lower body adiposity. Think Arnold Schwarzenegger. Think Tom Cruise. I'm a girl, so I think boys, right? But those individuals, when you think about them, are going to have a higher BMI when they step on a scale and their calculation gets put into their chart, okay? But meanwhile, their waist circumference or their body adiposity or a measure of body adiposity will be much lower than their BMI might indicate as a risk factor for disease. BMI also doesn't take into account ethnic population or gender. So thinking about BMI or beyond BMI, the United States Department of Health and Human Services actually put together a list, which I think is very important, to evaluate beyond BMI. So when you look at BMI and you look at the different classes of BMI, taking into consideration waist circumference, and those numbers are developed and recommended by the World Health Organization, specifically look at overweight and class 1 obesity and the change that happens when a waist circumference is less than 40 inches for men or 35 inches for women or more than 40 inches for men or more than 35 inches for women. Look what happens. You have an increase in risk. So for those of overweight, the risk of increase goes to high. And for those with obesity class 1, the risk goes from high to very high. But notice there's not much of a change for those who struggle with a BMI of 35 or higher, which has been consistent with the data suggesting that a BMI of 35 or higher and waist circumference doesn't necessarily increase or help you in assessing risk for an individual. Now here is the obesity prevalence of the United States as of 2015. I would know regions, okay? Now I know we all look at the state that we're in, right? We all look at the state that we're from. They all look at the state that we currently reside in. And that makes sense, but what you want to focus on here, especially when you're thinking of your exam preparation, is what are the territories? So key points are that there is no state in our country anymore that has an obesity prevalence of less than 20%. And if you look back in data in the 1980s and the 1990s and even the early 2000s, that wasn't the case. So we have seen an increase in the obesity prevalence across the board. Okay? And then the other key thing is looking at the geographic regions of where there's 30% or over 35% of a prevalence of obesity. Breaking this down further, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey is a way to conduct, the government, part of the CDC, actually is able to conduct research through surveys. And they're looking for prevalence data of different disease states. And this is how they collect their data, and what they were looking for is those with a BMI of over 30. And you can see here, all races at 34.9%. So two key things. One, I would know that number, and two, that number is important because it tells us that the disease state of obesity affects everybody, right? It's not just one particular group of folks, or it's not just adults, it's not just women, it's not just men, it's all races. And then there's further breakdown of the non-Hispanic Black population, the Hispanic population, Caucasians, and Asians. What's key is to know that there is a difference among ethnicities, but the overall number is 34.9%. And then when you look at the data in comparison chronologically, obviously the sample size between 1988 and 1994 is going to be larger because it's a longer time frame, but every year, every time thereafter was yearly. And the sample size, therefore, reflects the amount of folks that were either collected yearly or within that longer time frame. And I think what's key is that some folks might interpret this as, well, look, the overweight percentage has essentially remained the same. We're doing okay. But when you look at the rates for obesity, which was defined as BMI of over 30 to 40, there wasn't further classified at that stage of a BMI of 1, a BMI class of 1 or 2. It's all those folks that are between a BMI of 30 and 40, and we know those that have a BMI of over 35 are at higher risk, from that other slide we saw, for disease states. So those in that BMI category of 30 to 40, which is defined as the obese percentage, has gone from 23% in the 1980s to 34.9%. Remember that number that we just saw on the last slide? So that's a key number to know. And then the risks for those which were defined as extreme obesity, which is a BMI of over 40, has more than tripled. And these are the folks, as we know from that slide where we looked at BMI and waist circumference combined, assessment of risk, key factor. We know that those individuals are the ones that are struggling with the risks of increased diseases. And to further look at data, the BRFSS, I know it's a lot of alphabet soup what you see, but this is our government looking at different ways to collect data. So this is the Behavior Risk Factor Surveillance System, and this is statewide. Okay, this is where you're at dinner with your families and you're trying to have a conversation before rushing off to the next activity, and the telephone rings and it's somebody there trying to collect data from your household. And they want to know how many folks are in your household. They want to know how many people are on maybe this medication, or how many folks are self-reporting rates of obesity. So this is self-reported data, and this is looking at non-Hispanic Black adults. And you can see there's a lot of red, and that's indicating that over 35% of non-Hispanic Blacks are self-reporting obesity rates in these states. So that's a significant finding in terms of what we're seeing in terms of prevalence data. And this is looking at Hispanic adults. This is adults with a BMI of over 30. And you can see geographically that it's not as profound as those of the non-Hispanic African-American population, but still most states are reporting over 30% of obesity prevalence. So what about the future? And we're going to talk a little bit of why this graph looks like it does above my head here, right? So from the 1960s and 1980s, pretty stable, didn't see a big jump. And then from the 1970s to 80s to the 1990s, we saw a jump. And from there on, it looks almost linear. But what's key is that from the data from 2010 to projected data of 2030, which I cannot believe is merely 13 and a half years away, is that how many folks are potentially going to have a BMI of over 30 in our country. 50% of individuals in our country, adults, men, female, all races, right? Remember that 34.9% number I said was important? That is projected to increase to 50% by 2030 if we don't change what we're doing in healthcare today. And that's why you guys are here to help us get there. If you take that BMI to 25, the rate is actually 80%. That means 8 out of 10 people that are sitting in this room are going to have a BMI of over 25 by 2030. Think about what that means for our families as well as for us as individuals and how things are going to be affected in terms of our healthcare costs. And you're going to hear great lectures about pediatrics. What I'm bringing up here is the prevalence data. So what you want to focus on is that top line. Okay? So as many as 1 out of 5 U.S. adolescents are considered obese by the pediatric qualifications. You're going to hear pediatric lectures of how you can diagnose that. Okay? As many as 1 out of 6 U.S. elementary school age children are considered obese. And as many as 1 out of 12 preschool age children are considered obese by the NHANES data of 2012. I would imagine that this data is probably the same, if not worse, for when the next reported cycle will be. So this is important to know. So how did we get here? Well, a lot of things happened from the 1960s to the 1980s. We saw on the last couple of graphs that really there wasn't a lot of things that happened. We had a 10% prevalence of obesity that went to about 12 or 13%, not a significant change. But then in the 1980s, something happened. And what happened was genetics, cultural, societal, as well as governmental changes that have contributed to this epidemic. And so we're going to review a few of these things that have increased the obesity prevalence, okay? So drug-induced weight gain, right? How many folks do you treat or see, or how many individuals are in your family are now what we call polypharmacy, meaning they are on multiple medications to help control a lot of their disease states that seem like they're spiraling out of control. When I was an intern a long time ago, polypharmacy was defined when I was an intern admitting patients to the ER to go to various different floors would be 3 drugs or more. So if somebody was on more than 3 medications, you were kind of on the lookout for potential drug complications or interactions, right? You know, you would be careful about what kind of medications you would put this patient on while they're hospitalized. Today it's considered 5. And when you think about those medications, they're relatively common. Medications for high blood pressure, such as beta blockers, can be, unfortunately, what they call obesogenic or promoting weight gain. Medications to help control blood sugars. Medications that control mood. Some of the newer class of medications, particularly for mood disorders, can unfortunately promote weight gain. And I'm an OBGYN by primary trade, right? And when I took care of patients in the obstetrics world, we were very limited in what kind of medications we'd be able to offer our patients because of the limited data in terms of safety. So a lot of our patients would be on many of these medications that were weight promoting. So when we think about our individuals and the patients we're treating, this making adjustments in medications in this piece can be a very important piece of the puzzle. Cultural beliefs on food. So I'm not talking about what culture likes this food or what culture likes that food. I'm talking about dining out, okay? How many of us dine out? A lot of us, right? We're going to be dining out here. So think about how our families have changed. The family dynamics have changed since the 1960s and 1970s. We used to do more home-cooked meals. We would sit down and have dinner. Now, life is so busy. We're running around, we're grab-and-go foods. Those grab-and-go foods are unfortunately highly caloric and a lot of times not necessarily health-promoting. What about how this affects our behavior? So when something becomes a habit, right, we all form habits, how is they're much harder to break. So food cultural practices, unfortunately, can become habits. The medications that we take as individuals can unfortunately increase the probability of gaining weight. So all of these things, unfortunately, become interconnected and, unfortunately for individuals, are also increasing the risk for weight gain. Food marketing practices. I love this example I'm going to give you. So they looked at children, and they basically took 2 boxes of cereal, and one box had a superhero on it and all sorts of fun colors and said, eat me, I'm going to make you feel great, and did all this great stuff that looked enticing, and then this other box, just kind of bland and boring. had the same cereal. Guess which one the kids said that they liked better when they were asked? The superhero cereal. So companies know what we like to see, what engages us. When you think about foods that look colorful, they make us want them. Oh, that looks great, it looks appetizing, I'm going to eat that. So unfortunately, that also contributes to this particular obesity epidemic and prevalence. Our society has become less active when we think about what we used to be in the 1960s and 70s, and I'm picking on that time frame not for any particular reason other than we have great data from there. But even if you go further back, 19th century, 20th century, turn of the century, we were predominantly more of an agricultural society. We worked more on things outside. We did more physical activity. Today, we're much more technological. So therefore, we have reduced activity. Think about the individuals you care for who may take a car or some sort of transportation, a people mover, if you will, to get to their next people mover, like an elevator or a walking staircase or an escalator, and then they go and sit down for 8 hours a day, only to reverse that effect and then sit on watching TV or sitting in a car, taking their kids to and from. So our activity has been reduced, contributing to the epidemic. And then, of course, genetics. So although it's clearly a genetic influence, obesity is not a simple Mendelian trait. So ultimately, there's various different models of obesity and genetics that are associated, and monogenic obesity was mainly due to mutations, very straightforward, in genes that were encoding proteins involved in the leptin-melanocortin pathways. And you're going to learn a lot about leptin and melanocortin pathways in pathophysiology lectures, but for the purposes of genetics, it's important to know that when we identified those pathways, we were able to identify the defects or the mutations there and how treatment could possibly be afforded. It also opened our eyes to the fact that, wow, there's mutations in these genes that is increasing the risk for individuals to struggle with weight. Maybe there's other types of mutations in genes that are causing folks to struggle with weight. And that ultimately led to these genetic association studies, which as recently as 2015, was able to show an analysis over 300,000 individuals in our country, and there's 97 BMI-associated genetic loci that are showing, 56 of which are new, and are showing expression in different ways, multiple variants of expression, of how weight can be affected in this individual with this genetic expression, sort of like turning on the gene or turning it off, or what causes that gene to actually be enabled and increase that person's risk for weight. So for instance, the FTO gene, which is the fat mass and obesity-associated gene region, is the first region that's been unequivocally associated with higher BMI and higher body fat mass. So that means that that person who is struggling with weight, who has a higher BMI and higher body adiposity, will genetically always be so, right? So that perhaps will help us understand the disease state of obesity and perhaps look at different ways to classify it. But for now, understanding what BMI does and its limitations is key. And certainly, there's a variety of different genetic codes that have been unraveled, if you will, in order for us to understand better the genetics and how it's associated with the disease state. But for what your purposes are in understanding the basics of genetics and understanding that there are genetic syndromes and syndromal causes of obesity, know that the only chromosome that doesn't show any obesity loci is the Y chromosome. And not to go back to the leptin concept, but you have to understand that syndromal causes of obesity and genetic syndromes are involving the leptin-melanocortin pathway. You're going to hear about that in pathophysiology, but this is just some history of how leptin got discovered. And then thinking about how are you going to assess somebody who may have a genetic syndrome that you're considering for obesity. So as clinicians, we all do history and physicals, right? We gather data, we're looking at examining patients, we're looking at what's going on, what could be the cause, how can we treat this patient. So if you are suspecting a genetic syndrome, this is a pathway to take you through of ways to evaluate your patient and things to look for and what possible syndromes could be. But what you want to know is the most common syndromal cause of obesity is Prader-Willi syndrome. You will hear the details of Prader-Willi in pediatrics, but from an epidemiologic and prevalence standpoint, about 1 in 25,000 individuals have this. and these folks do struggle with weight. The most common obesity syndrome is the MC4R syndrome, and that's about 1 in 2,000 individuals. And when you think about that, most of us are going to see at least 2,000 patients at some point in time, and that means that eventually a genetic syndrome of obesity is going to come through our doors. And here is a list of genetic obesity syndromes. There's a syndrome name and the main distinguishing features. I would be familiar just with what those look like. And then switching gears a little bit, let's talk about socio-demographic and economic factors. So this kind of intertwines with another talk I'm giving, which is on practice management, and this has to do with bias, right? So the common perception is that, unfortunately, those that struggle with weight are unmotivated, uneducated, and live in poverty. Many of you may have heard this type of thing when you're talking about treating your patients or even how it affects friends or family members. But the data that has come from the CDC and that National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is NHANES, actually proves that this is not necessarily true for everyone. Okay? So this slide is going to demonstrate the most recent data that we have nationally looking at prevalence data of obesity and what they call the PIR, or the Poverty Index Ratio, and that's what's on that slide up there. So a poverty index ratio was basically defined as if your PIR is greater than 350%, back in 2008 when this was the last data collected, that would mean that you made an annual income of about $77,000 a year. If your poverty index ratio was less than 130%, that meant that you made about $29,000 a year. And if your poverty index ratio was somewhere in between, obviously you made somewhere between $29,000 a year and $77,000 a year. So when they looked at this, they were trying to see, well, is this true? Is it true that those who struggle with weight are more or less living in poverty? And the answer is no. So for men, the key point is that the obesity prevalence actually decreases as the income is lower. So there's actually a higher rate of rates of obesity prevalence in men at higher incomes overall. And the specific numbers are 33% of men whose incomes are over $77,000 a year, or over the 350% mark, struggle with obesity, as compared to 29% of men whose poverty income ratio, or makes less than $29,000 a year, is struggling with obesity. So 33 versus 29%. And this was seen consistently in all races as well. So non-Hispanic, African-American men and Mexican-American men, they also was found to have, statistically, the prevalence data that those who were at higher incomes actually had higher prevalence of obesity than those who had lower incomes. So what about women? Well, the reverse is true. For those women who are at higher incomes, meaning the PIR, or the poverty index ratio, of over 350%, they made greater than $77,000 a year, they had a higher rate of obesity prevalence. They had a lower rate of obesity prevalence, 29%. For those women who had a lower income, or a PIR of less than 130%, they had a higher rate of obesity, of 42%. And the only exception, and I would know this, is non-Hispanic white women. It was the reverse was true. So what about education? Does that have an effect? Are folks who struggle with weight less educated, not well aware of what's going on in the world? So education level was defined as high school diploma, some college degree, things like that. And in men, there was no significant trend seen in education and obesity prevalence. In women, there was an increased obesity prevalence in lower education. So those data points I would know. And overall, there's an increased obesity prevalence across all education levels. So that bias, or that stigma, is not true. So environmental factors I could do an entire talk on this alone, but from a prevalence data standpoint, it's important to know that there's more and more data that's emerging about our environmental pollutants that's affecting our biochemistry and the increased risk for obesity, as well as insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So for instance, stress with increased cortisol, increasing the sympathetic nervous system, increases hunger through the leptin-melanocortin pathway. And why you don't see excess cortisol in these folks, is like if you ever draw that blood test, is because the hypertrophied and increased number of adipocytes, which we're going to talk about in just a little bit, can actually increase the clearance of cortisol, so you'll see normal serum cortisol levels. Heavy metal pollutants, you may have seen in the news, cadmium, arsenic, mercury, all of those disrupt the insulin pathways as well as the adipocyte insulin sensitivity. So therefore there's abnormal ratios and increased insulin resistance. So what you need to know is that these heavy metals increase insulin resistance, increase the risk for type 2 diabetes, and increase the risk for obesity. POP is persistent organic pollutants. The data is still a bit unclear as to whether or not there's a causal link, but there is a belief that due to the pathways through insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, that obesity would also be linked to these as well. They were originally thought of as endocrine disruptors. You may have heard that term before. So persistent organic pollutants essentially are the endocrine disruptors. They're affecting change in how the body processes, in particular in the space of obesity, insulin sensitivity as well as glucohomeostasis. And then, of course, prenatal influences and sleep. So from a prenatal influence, there's been a lot of data that's emerging in terms of gestational weight gain, interval pregnancy weight gain, and maternal obesity. A lot of data also looking at, or a lot of individuals looking at, is there a relationship between birth weight and risk for overweight and obesity later in life? So some epidemiologic studies have found an association between maternal obesity, which is defined as BMI of over 30. It doesn't further classify class 1, class 2, or class 3 obesity, and the developing fetal brain, which is now affecting cognitive ability, meaning that there's decreased IQ on fetuses or children that are born that are exposed to the maternal obesity environment, as well as cognitive deficits and an increased risk for the autism spectrum disorder as well as ADHD. So all of the evaluations and thoughts on what causes autism may come back to weight and the inflammatory metabolic processes that are occurring in that interface between mom and developing baby. And why this is happening, and this slide gives you, a very nice, concise pathway. You don't need to know all of those details, but you want to know that as the fetal brain is developing, the maternal free fatty acids, triglycerides, and excess inflammatory markers are having an effect on the developing fetal brain, which is affecting the future child's metabolic adaptation and stress response. And that hopefully makes sense because the metabolic adaptation is due to the fetus dealing with the hyperglycemic environment and the triggers from the free fatty acids, and then from the maternal adipocyte side, there's an increase in inflammation that's crossing the placenta and affecting the fetus as it's developing. And then in terms of looking at relationship between birth weight and risk of developing overweight and obesity, so there's a fractional regression model that looked at this. So if you look at the x-axis, that's birth weight, and 3,000 grams, 4,000 grams, 5,000 grams is about 6.5 pounds, 8.5 pounds, and 11 pounds, just to give you a perspective of what that is. And then the y-axis is looking at relative risk. And overall, what you're seeing is this is the U-shaped curve right here. So you know how you hear about, well, there could be a birth weight of 11, 12 pounds, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to develop obesity, and that's true based on these findings. But there is still an increased risk. So when I first saw this slide, I thought, or saw this graph, I thought, oh, it looks like checkmate, right? Here you go. The higher the birth weight, the higher the risk. And there is a linear association that the higher the birth weight, the higher the risk. But overall, it is not a prediction based on birth weight alone. And then last but not least, sleep, a favorite topic of mine to bring up with patients. So the data has shown that for less quality of sleep and less hours of sleep, meaning if average individual gets 5 hours of sleep as opposed to 8, the ratios of leptin and ghrelin. You're going to hear a lot about those hormones in pathophysiology, but it's important to know that the ratios are affected in such a way that it's promoting hunger through the leptin-melanocortin pathway, and that unfortunately affects the individual's food intake. So it may make sense to you when you think about how much food that you might consume when you're tired, right? And one way to try to wake up. And then the cost of obesity in terms of our future. We had talked about 2030 and what the predictions would be. So here's our costs and here's the breakdown, right? That by 2030, if we were able to reduce that BMI of 30 to 25, or even 25 to 20, we could save in our country and U.S. spending from healthcare costs approximately $600 billion. That's a lot of money. And there's a lot of very interested folks that are looking at this and trying to decide how we're going to make changes in order to be able to not have significant costs from a healthcare perspective. So what are the real costs of obesity? Right? These are the medical costs. These are not just finances of how much things are being evaluated, but pulmonary disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, heart disease, arthritis, cancers. We're going to talk about some of these in just a bit. We know that 5 to 10% weight loss actually can really improve certain disease states such as type 2 diabetes, heart disease, risk factors, improve blood pressure, lipids, and sleep apnea. And we're going to review what those look like in just a bit. Here's other disease states. I'd be familiar with this list of what is improved by losing 5 to 10% of baseline body weight. And here's the averages of improvements overall in individuals who are able to lose 5 to 10%. And this is important when you're thinking about metabolic syndrome, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. The decreases in triglycerides, LDLs, improvements in HDLs, and improvements in blood pressure. So here is the list of what we're going to go through in obesity-related disorders. We're going to focus on cardiovascular disease and metabolic syndrome, talk about stroke, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, gallstones, sleep apnea, dementia and cancer. All right, so definition of metabolic syndrome, you guys are very familiar with this, but essentially if an individual has 3 out of the 5 criteria, this would qualify as metabolic syndrome. It has to do with blood pressure, impaired glycemia, dyslipidemia, the numbers are here, such as triglycerides greater than 150 milligrams per deciliter, HDLs less than 50 in women, less than 40 in men, and then waist circumference. So these measurements are by the WHO criteria. It is different for those of Asian descent, so I would be familiar with that. So why is this important? Why are we talking about obesity-related disorders? What's it got to do with weight? Well, that's because when you get back to the basics, adipocytes are actually an endocrine-type organ, an endocrine-type cell. They secrete a lot of different substances, hormones as well as cytokines and things, inflammatory markers, things that influence an individual. We're going to talk about how that happens. So here you have an example of the association between excess visceral adipose tissue as well as metabolic syndrome. So what happens, right? So because of the expansion of the adipose tissue and the hypertrophy of the cells as well as the hyperplasia of the cells, you see increased leptin, cytokines, free fatty acids, and ultimately decrease of adiponectin, which is those ratios affect the CNS through the leptin-melanocortin system to increase food intake. It also affects muscle by increasing insulin resistance. It affects the liver, again, by free fatty acid oxidation and insulin resistance. And it also affects the immune system by increasing inflammation, which then in turn, due to the inflammation, increases the risk for atherosclerosis. So let's look at metabolic syndrome then from a slightly different perspective. First couple of slides, which may have seemed like forever ago, we looked at BMI, right? BMI defines currently an individual's weight and classifies their weight as a risk factor for disease states in combination, especially with assessment for visceral adiposity or waist circumference. So when you put that together with looking at the risk factors for metabolic syndrome, all the 5 definitions, the hypertension, the waist circumference, the lipids, as well as the impaired fasting glycemia, and then you add a novel risk factor of inflammation, which comes from the excess adiposity, right, because we just saw what the adipocytes are secreting, that leads to coronary artery disease. Okay. And the other slide on here shows that on the x-axis, that's the increasing number of risk factors for metabolic syndrome, meaning how many components of metabolic syndrome does an individual have, and the increased C-reactive protein level increases the risk for coronary artery disease or cardiovascular disease. I like to look at this from a different perspective. Call me crazy, I'm a power of positive thinker. What if we're able to reduce the risks of metabolic syndrome by helping an individual reduce their weight? We already know that 5 to 10% weight loss will substantially increase an individual's ability to have improvements in blood pressure, improve lipids, and if we're decreasing the adipocytes, we're also decreasing the inflammatory markers. So we're essentially taking away the number of components of metabolic syndrome, we're lowering the C-reactive protein. Could we, in effect, reduce the risk of somebody developing coronary artery disease? Could we turn the clock back in somebody who's going in the wrong direction? And overall, my hope is the answer will be yes, because if an individual continues in terms of the weight gain, there's a direct association of obesity, insulin resistance, and heart disease. And this is the pathways that show how. So as the weight is increased, for each BMI that's increasing, there is an increased risk of heart failure development of approximately 5% in men and 7% in women. So that is something I would know. And the reason for that is because of the increased intramyocardial fatty acid deposition, the increased inflammation that's affecting the buildup of plaque in the blood vessels and atherosclerosis, ultimately all leading to left ventricular dysfunction and leading to essentially heart failure. And then looking at the data here, while it's from 2004, it's still very, very important, because what's clinically significant when they looked at what are the risk factors in terms of association for stenosed vessels and cardiovascular disease, essentially it was metabolic syndrome and diastolic blood pressure that was the biggest clinically significant factor. So we know what the components of metabolic syndrome are, right? So if we can reduce that, we can reduce the risk of somebody's risk of stenosed vessels, as well as if we're able to improve fasting glycemia, improve blood sugars, we're able to actually reduce the risk of stenosed coronary vessels as well. Obesity is a known association with hypertension. This slide shows you the pathogenesis of obesity-related hypertension. So that has to do with, again, the central adiposity, the central increased hypertrophy, and not only in number, but in also the function of the adipocytes, which is leading to increased leptin levels and taking through the pathway of the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which ultimately leads to increased aldosterone production and salt sensitivity, leading to hypertension. And then there is a risk of obesity and atrial fibrillation. For each BMI unit increase, there's a risk 4% of atrial fibrillation. I would know that statistic. This was seen in the Framingham Heart Study, over 5,000 participants looking at this epidemiologic risk factor, so that is important. The reasons for this is not only due to the fact that there's an increased left ventricular volume and therefore left atrial volume due to the increased cardiac output, but also due to the inflammation that's coming from the adipocytes, the inflammation that's affecting those cells, and the increased fatty acid or the fatty deposition in the muscle wall. They also think it has to do with oxidative stress. There's also an increase in stroke, specifically hemorrhagic and ischemic stroke. So for every BMI unit that's increased, there's an associated increase of hemorrhagic stroke by 6% and an increase of ischemic stroke by 4%. And you may be familiar with the N. Haynes data that came out a little while ago that looked at, there's a lot of media coverage about, oh my gosh, there's a 3 times increased risk of stroke in women. And it was a young age group of 35 to 54, and they suggested aspirin and other different modalities to treat. But the underlying pathology had to do with metabolic syndrome. The increased waist circumference, the increased triglycerides, as well as the resulting hypertension. So when you think about getting to a point where we're helping to manage weight, to reduce weight for our individuals that are struggling with weight, we're able to really affect change and reduce the risk of stroke. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the prevalence data is pretty profound. Overall general population's 15 to 30%. But look at those with a BMI of 30 and a BMI of 40. So 90% prevalence in those with a BMI of over 40. That's pretty profound. And 57 to 74% for those with a BMI of over 30. It is becoming the most common indication for liver failure and liver transplantation in the United States. I would be familiar with those data points. Gallbladder disease and obesity has been a known association. This goes over why, as well as looks at what the prevalence data is. So when the Nurses' Health Study looked over 90,000 women between the ages of 34 and 59 and found that the risk for those with a BMI of 30 compared to a BMI of less than 25, the risk was doubled. So those of normal weight compared to those with a BMI of 30, the risk is doubled. Compared to women with a BMI of 45, the risk is 7-fold. So that's pretty profound. And the reason why is the increased cholesterol turnover relative to body fat. So for every increased kilogram of excess body weight, there's 20 milligrams of additional cholesterol that needs to be synthesized, and that relationship to bile acids and phospholipids is what increases the risk for gallstones. So I'd be familiar with that pathophysiology. And key is also the recycling of weight. Those that lose weight and regain, the relative risk for cholecystectomy increases from 1.2 to 3.68. Obesity and sleep apnea. We know what sleep apnea is, right? Recurrent arousal, sleep fragmentation, nocturnal hypoxemia. But the prevalence data is important. So you'll remember 30% for BMI of 30, because they both have 30. But the prevalence is pretty wide, from 50 to 98% for a BMI of 40. Okay? I think that the reason for that has to do with underreporting. Maybe we're not asking the right questions, and maybe our patients are embarrassed to say that they're snoring at night. But one way to screen for it is to measure neck circumference. You're going to hear more about that in assessment. But if a neck circumference is greater than 17 inches in men or 16 inches in women, that would be a prompter for you to inquire more about the possibility of sleep apnea, especially if the BMI is over 40 or over 30. The key thing is that the sleep study is the way to diagnose, and the observed sleep studies are recommended, especially for those who do have associated health conditions. So the portable monitors are recommended for those that do not have comorbid conditions or significant conditions, but the sleep study that's observed and done in a sleep lab is better for those that do have the conditions like that are listed here. Obesity and dementia used to be an association, almost a linear relationship. For those that with every increasing unit of BMI, there'd be an increasing risk of Alzheimer's disease, especially in women by age of 70. Why women over men? Because women tended to live longer than men. Sorry, guys. But there was a recent cohort study in the UK that looked at 2 million individuals, and this was not necessarily the finding. So this is a stay tuned for dementia. And then in terms of cancer, however, there has been association, overall evidence between BMI and cancer risk of 17 out of 22 observed cancers, that also in the UK, over 5 million adults. So pretty profound results where they found for every 5-unit increase of BMI, there was a linear increased risk of certain cancers such as uterus, gallbladder, kidney, cervix, thyroid, and leukemia. And the BMI was also positively associated with these other cancers listed, particularly liver, colon, ovarian, and postmenopausal breast cancers. Interestingly, underweight had an association of increased cancers as well, but decreased risk of postmenopausal breast cancer and prostate cancer. And then in terms of mortality and BMI, certainly this slide was not meant to say, okay, everybody needs to aim for a BMI of 22 to 25 to have that chance of living by age 70. But I think the key thing is that the BMI of 35 or higher, which is that number that we've talked about quite a bit, has shown that it will affect an individual's quality of life as well as mortality rate. That there has been evidence to suggest that there is decreased years of life the higher the BMI. And certainly the psychosocial impact of obesity, there is a significant twofold increased risk for those with a BMI of 30 to struggle with major depressive disorder. Reasons why are still somewhat unclear. There's some evidence that it could have to do with the way serotonin and serotonin receptors interact in the brain, especially in those that struggle with weight. But the overall perception is that really it's due to the stigma and the social environment that individuals who struggle with weight are facing that contributes to the mood, anxiety, and personality disorders that we're seeing more and more. So in all, obesity is a chronic and multifactorial disease. There's no easy way to get to patients on a regular basis due to bias and stigma. Folks are struggling to be able to get access to care. But we know that 5 to 10% weight loss can have a profound effect on reducing disease, can also have a profound effect on how it's going to affect families, communities, and our United States, as well as the financial impact for our country. And I applaud all of you for taking the first steps to being here, getting board certified, and learning more about this, because it truly is one of the most gratifying jobs you can ever do. So I think I've run out of time, and thank you very much. There are some questions that I think are in your books, but I'm available for questions as well. So thank you very much. Have a great day.